If there was one thing Walter hated more than the damp chill of the ocean's murky depths, it was the cloying stench of secrets. The hidden city of Thalassia, nestled comfortably beneath the Pacific like a pearl in a clam, had both in spades. Of course, the surface world had no clue about this submerged metropolis, a fact that seemed to amuse the city's inhabitants more than anything. Thalassians had a peculiar sense of enjoyment, much like watching a circus while knowing you're the only one who sees the clown without pants. Walter, Thalassia's premier geneticist, was presently hunching over a terminal in his lab, the blue glow highlighting the bags under his eyes. He looked like a raccoon who'd been on a bender, with hair that had given up the battle against gravity weeks ago. His fingers danced over the keyboard with the kind of dexterity you'd expect from a guy who spent more time with his computer than actual people. "Oh, look," he muttered to himself, "another file labeled Do Not Open, because that's never been a problem before." He chuckled darkly, remembering the last time he'd ignored such a warning. It had ended with a small explosion and a very annoyed lab assistant. But curiosity was a tempting mistress, and she was wearing an especially low-cut dress today. The file in question had cropped up while he was supposed to be investigating Earth's lost colonies, a task that was about as rewarding as trying to track down your missing left sock. This particular file, though, was encrypted, with security tighter than a miser's grip on his last dollar. So naturally, Walter's interest was piqued. He tapped a few keys, hoping the encryption was about as sophisticated as a child's piggy bank. To his surprise, the digital lock was more like Fort Knox, but Walter loved a challenge, mostly because it gave him an excuse to avoid actual work. As he worked, the lab's door hissed open. In walked Dr. Morga, a colleague who possessed all the warmth of a polar bear's backside. Walter, still poking around in the digital trash. Walter didn't glance up. If by trash you mean potentially groundbreaking discoveries that'll either make us legends or kill us horribly, then yes. Morga snorted. "You're like a cat that keeps sniffing the same empty tin." "Curiosity did kill the cat," Walter replied, "but I'm not even convinced I'm alive most days, so I think I'm safe." With a final keystroke, the encryption cracked open like an egg under a sledgehammer. Walter leaned back, smirking. And there we are. Let's see what the universe has been hiding. The screen filled with text and schematics, a collage of data that screamed top secret in a language only scientists and conspiracy theorists could understand. Walter scanned the files, his eyes widening as realization dawned on him. Morga peered over his shoulder, her eyebrows inching upwards. "Is that cloning data?" Walter nodded, his mind racing. "Looks like someone was trying to play God, or just trying to make a better version of themselves," Morga quipped. Wouldn't be the first time someone looked in the mirror and panicked. As they delved deeper, one thing became clear. This was no ordinary project. The files hinted at a network of labs, possibly linked to the lost colonies, all working on cloning technology far beyond anything Walter had seen. "This is big," Morga said, surprisingly serious for once. "No kidding," Walter replied. "If this tech fell into the wrong hands, well, let's just say it wouldn't be good news for the original copies of humanity." Morga gave him a look. "You mean us?" Walter shrugged. "Depends on whether you think we're original or just the first widely released models." As they pondered this existential predicament, the lab's intercom crackled to life. "Doctor, Walter, you're needed in the council chamber. Immediately." Walter sighed. "Great, another one of those meetings where they pretend to listen to me before doing whatever they want anyway." Morga patted his shoulder with mock sympathy. "Don't worry, I'm sure your opinion will be ignored in record time." He shut down the terminal, the encrypted files now copied to a secure drive, just in case the council decided some things were better left buried. Walter had learned long ago that knowledge was power, and sometimes power was best kept in your back pocket. As he made his way through Thalassia's winding corridors, Walter couldn't shake the feeling that he just stumbled into something much bigger than a mere scientific curiosity. The kind of bigger that usually ended with someone getting a very uncomfortable visit from a very unpleasant person. The council chamber was a vast, echoing space that seemed designed to make any individual feel insignificant. It was as though the architects had asked themselves, how can we embody bureaucracy and existential dread in one room? And then really nailed it. Seated around a crescent-shaped table were Thalash's leadership, each sporting expressions that ranged from mildly disinterested to actively hostile. Walter took his place, offering a nod that conveyed all the respect he couldn't be bothered to verbally express. The head of the council, a woman named Alara, who wielded authority like a bad-tempered librarian, cleared her throat. "Dr. Walter, it has come to our attention that you've been accessing restricted files." "Good to know you have attention," Walter replied. "I was starting to wonder." Alara's eyes narrowed. "This is serious." "So was my last relationship," Walter shot back, "and we all know how that ended." A ripple of suppressed amusement passed through the chamber, quickly squashed by Alara's glare. "These files, they pose a risk, a very real threat to Thalash's safety." Walter leaned forward, adopting an expression that could almost pass for sincerity. "Or they could offer solutions to problems we haven't even encountered yet." "Or," Alara countered, "they could lead to disaster." "Life's kind of all about risk, isn't it?" Walter said, with a grin that suggested he'd never met a risk he didn't want to shake hands with. Alara sighed, a sound that spoke volumes about her lack of patience. "We need to know what you intend to do with this information, Doctor." "Walter, for starters," Walter began, "how about we figure out who buried this treasure chest of forbidden science in our digital backyard?" Another council member, a man named Horik, interjected. "And why should we trust you to handle this, Walter?" Walter spread his hands wide. "Because who better to entrust with potential doom than the guy who found it?" "That's a disturbingly compelling argument," Horik admitted. Alara rubbed her temples, clearly restraining herself from chucking something heavy at Walter. "Fine, but you're on a very short leash, Walter." "Short leashes, long corridors," Walter replied. "Sounds like my kind of race." The meeting wrapped up with the usual murmurings of discontent and bureaucratic grumbling. As Walter left the chamber, he couldn't help but feel a thrill of excitement mixed with an overwhelming sense of impending doom. It was the kind of mixture that made life interesting, assuming you didn't value your life too highly. Back in his lab, Walter sat at his desk, staring at the secure drive like it was a Pandora's box wrapped in an enigmatic enigma. His mind buzzing with possibilities and potential consequences, he reached for his communicator. "Hey, Morga," he said, his voice tinged with a mix of exhilaration and dread. "You up for a little adventure?" Morga's voice crackled through the device, her tone dry as salt water. "Depends. Are we talking sneak into restricted areas adventure or accidentally blow something up adventure?" "Why not both?" Walter grinned. "You're lucky I have a poor sense of self-preservation," Morga replied. Walter chuckled, glancing at the drive once more. "Meet me in the lab. Bring your best reckless disregard for safety." As he waited for Morga, Walter couldn't help but wonder what lay at the end of this twisted trail of secrets. The promise of forbidden knowledge was a siren's call, and Walter was already halfway to jumping overboard. "Well," he said to himself, "here's hoping curiosity doesn't kill this particular cat." The door slid open, and Morga walked in, carrying a toolkit and a grin that matched Walter's own. "Ready to poke the bear?" "Always," Walter replied, his fingers itching to uncover the mysteries that lay ahead. As they delved into the files once more, a sense of foreboding clawed at Walter's gut. But excitement and the promise of discovery were powerful antidotes to fear. And so they began, not knowing that the road they were embarking upon would lead to revelations that would shake not only Thalasha, but the very foundations of humanity itself. As the terminal hummed to life, Walter and Morga set off on their journey into the unknown, a journey laced with danger, secrets, and the kind of humor only the damned seemed to appreciate. Walter and Morga had spent the better part of the afternoon locked in a staring contest with their terminal, rifling through a mountain of encrypted files that might as well have been written in ancient Sanskrit for all the sense they made. Sure, there were diagrams, but they looked like a toddler with a crayon had gotten loose on the screen. It was going to take more than Walter's half-baked decryption skills to unravel this mess. "Remind me again why we're doing this," Morga asked, pulling her eyes away from the screen just long enough to throw Walter a look that screamed, "This better be worth it. Because it's either this or listen to me explain why splicing a banana with a cucumber isn't the breakthrough agriculture thinks it is," Walter replied, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Besides, I've already wagered my dignity on this. Might as well see where it leads," Morga snorted. "Dignity? You lost that years ago, probably around the time you thought dyeing your hair with squid ink was a good idea." "I maintain that it was fashion-forward," Walter shot back, though his grin suggested he knew exactly how ridiculous he'd looked. They'd hit a proverbial wall and both knew it. Which is why Walter had called in Elijah, a resourceful engineer with a knack for making the unintelligible suddenly coherent. She'd helped him out of more than one technological quagmire in the past, usually with a few well-placed insults and a lot of eye-rolling. Elijah arrived in her usual whirlwind of energy, carrying what appeared to be enough equipment to launch a small satellite. She dropped her bag onto the floor with a thud that echoed through the lab. "You two look like you could use a miracle," she said, her voice somewhere between amused and exasperated. "More like divine intervention," Walter replied, gesturing to the mess of files on the terminal. "Got anything in that bag of tricks that can help?" Elijah cocked an eyebrow. "Depends on whether you're asking me to fix your love life or your lab life. At this point, I'm not sure which is in worse shape," Walter admitted. "But let's stick to the files for now." Elijah got to work, her fingers moving over the controls with the kind of confidence usually reserved for lion tamers and bomb diffusers. Within minutes, she'd bypassed the labyrinthine security and was sifting through the data with ruthless efficiency. "Here's your problem," she said, tapping a segment of text that had previously been hidden behind layers of digital obfuscation. "These files are part of a master plan. Cloning humans, but with a twist. They were aiming for a new species altogether." Walter felt a shiver run down his spine. "A new species. The kind that eats us for breakfast, or the kind that just outcompetes us at everything, judging by these notes the latter. Think of it as competitive evolution on steroids," Elijah replied, her tone disturbingly casual. "This project was abandoned," Morga noted, scanning the data. "Something about ethical concerns." "Yeah, like having a conscience suddenly became trendy," Walter muttered. "But if it was abandoned, why are we looking at current activity? Because someone out there didn't get the memo about playing God being a bad idea," Elijah said, nodding towards a string of recent timestamps. "Looks like they've picked up where the last team chickened out." "Fantastic," Morga said, her sarcasm as thick as the ocean above them. "Just what we need. An underground arms race for who can create the best abomination." Walter ran a hand through his hair, his brow furrowed. "So, what's the worst-case scenario?" Elijah gave him a look that suggested she really wished he hadn't asked. "Worst case. They perfect the process, clone an army of superhumans, and society as we know it goes the way of the dodo. Best case?" Morga asked, though her tone suggested she wasn't expecting much in the way of optimism. "Best case. We find them, shut them down, and get a commendation for stopping the end of the world," Elijah said, though she didn't sound like she believed it for a second. "Well, when you put it like that, how could we not dive headfirst into this mess?" Walter grinned, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "You've got a plan, genius." Morga crossed her arms, leaning back with the kind of skepticism that could deflate an ego from 50 paces. "I'm working on it," Walter replied, though he knew he was lying through his teeth. Elijah sighed, packing up her equipment. "You'd better work fast. We're playing with forces that make the council look like a bunch of toddlers with finger paint." As Elijah left, Walter and Morga were left with a decision that weighed heavier than the water above their heads. They needed to find out who had resumed the project and why, all without alerting the wrong people that they were poking around. "So, what's the move?" Morga asked, her voice low, wary. "We dig deeper." Quietly, Walter replied, though he knew that quietly wasn't exactly his specialty. "Let's start by tracing the data. See where it leads us." Morga nodded, though a spark of doubt lingered in her eyes. "And if we find something bad," Walter shrugged, a gesture that was both flippant and resigned. "Then we do what we always do: hope for the best, prepare for the worst, and keep plenty of fire extinguishers handy." They set to work, their fingers flying over the terminal as they followed the digital breadcrumbs left behind by whoever had resurrected this unethical Frankenstein's monster. Walter felt a thrill of excitement, tempered by the knowledge that each step forward was likely to invite trouble on a scale he could scarcely imagine. "Hey, Morga," Walter said, his gaze still fixed on the screen. "You ever think about what you'd do if you knew you were about to unleash something terrible?" "Every time I let you talk me into one of your harebrained schemes," Morga replied dryly. At least some things never changed. The trail they were following was as twisted and convoluted as a politician's promise, but Walter was nothing if not persistent. His mind raced, piecing together the fragments of information like a drunken jigsaw puzzle. Finally, something clicked. A network of communication nodes spread across Thalassia, connected in a way that suggested recent activity. Whoever was behind this had been careful, but not careful enough. "Gotcha," Walter murmured, his grin wolfish. Morga, peering over his shoulder, raised an eyebrow. "You look entirely too happy for someone who just found out the world might end. It's not every day you get to outsmart a shadowy cabal," Walter said, his voice laced with glee. "Right, because that's exactly what I wanted on my resume," Morga replied, rolling her eyes. "What's the next step, Sherlock?" "We pay a visit to the source," Walter said, already standing up, adrenaline coursing through his veins. "We need to find out what they know before they find out what we know," Morga sighed, a sound that was becoming all too familiar. "And you're sure you want to do this without backup?" Walter paused, considering. "I've got all the backup I need," he said finally, though the bravado in his voice was a thin veil over the uncertainty beneath. "Great. We're doomed," Morga muttered, grabbing her coat. The corridors of Thalassia were empty as they made their way to the location Walter had pinpointed. Each step echoed with the weight of what they were about to uncover. It was the kind of silence that made you acutely aware of your own heartbeat. "Remind me why I agreed to this again," Morga asked, her tone half joking but mostly serious. "Because deep down, you know it's the right thing to do," Walter replied. "Or maybe I'm just a glutton for punishment," she quipped, though her smile was genuine. They reached the entrance to the clandestine lab, and Walter paused, hand hovering over the control panel. "Ready? No," Morga replied. "But since when has that ever stopped us?" Walter chuckled, entering the access code he'd pilfered from the files. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a room filled with equipment that hummed ominously in the dim light. The place was a high-tech Frankenstein's lab, with machines that buzzed and blinked with the kind of unsettling efficiency that spoke of practices best left to horror stories. Walter felt a chill crawl up his spine as he realized just how real this nightmare had become. They crept forward, eyes scanning the room for anything that might explain what was going on. It didn't take long to find the centerpiece, a massive tank filled with a murky liquid that shimmered with an unsettling bioluminescence. Inside, a figure floated, indistinct but unmistakably human. "Well, that's not something you see every day," Morga said, her voice a mix of awe and disgust. Walter approached the tank, his mind racing. "This must be the prototype," he murmured, trying to ignore the implications of what that meant. "Think it's alive?" Morga asked, her gaze fixed on the figure in the tank. "Only one way to find out," Walter replied, though the thought filled him with dread. They searched the room for anything that might give them more answers, poring over data logs and research notes with the kind of intensity usually reserved for last-minute exam cramming. It didn't take long to piece together the grim truth. The project had been resumed, not as a scientific endeavor, but as a means to create a new ruling class. Humans, but better, faster, smarter, free from the physical and moral failings that plagued their predecessors. Well, that's comforting, Morga said, her voice dry as dust. Let's just hope they don't decide we're surplus to requirements. Walter nodded, his mind already racing with possibilities. We need to shut this down. Now, and how exactly do you plan to do that? Morga asked, though she was already moving to disable the equipment. She might complain, but she was nothing if not loyal. Carefully, and with a lot of luck, Walter replied, his finger hovering over a button labeled Emergency Shutdown. Let's hope the universe is feeling generous, Morga quipped. As they worked, a sense of urgency clawed at them like a rabid beast. They knew they were playing with forces far beyond their control, but it was too late to back out now. The terminal buzzed with warnings as they initiated the shutdown sequence, alarms blaring like a chorus of angry mechanized banshees. Walter's heart pounded, adrenaline coursing through his veins as he wrestled with the system's fail-safes. Just as it seemed they might succeed, the door behind them slammed open, and a group of armed guards poured into the room, weapons raised and expressions set to murderous. "Looks like we've got company," Morga said, her voice tight with fear but laced with defiance. Walter glanced at her, his eyes filled with both determination and regret. Well, here's hoping curiosity doesn't kill this particular cat. With no other choice, they prepared to face the consequences of their actions, each wondering if they'd manage to survive the day, or if they'd be just another footnote in the annals of scientific hubris. But one thing was certain. One way or another, they were going to find out just how deep this rabbit hole went. And if they were very, very lucky, they might even make it out in one piece. Thalassia was the kind of place where secrets were a currency more volatile than the stock market, and just as liable to ruin you if you weren't careful. Walter knew this better than most, which is why he was absolutely certain they were about to step in it with both feet. Elijah had caught up with them, her expression hovering somewhere between exasperation and reluctant admiration. "You two geniuses managed to save the world yet? Or are you just working on getting yourselves killed?" "We're multitasking," Walter shot back, not bothering to slow his pace as they hustled through the nearly deserted corridors of Thalassia. Turns out the Council has been running a cover-up that's tighter than a miser's fist, and the Council loves nothing more than denying everything short of gravity itself, Elijah replied, her eyes scanning for any sign that they were being watched. So what's their latest excuse? According to them, this project doesn't exist. Which is interesting, considering we just found its not-so-metaphorical heart beating in a tank, Morga chimed in, her voice as dry as the Sahara. Elijah snorted. Classic political move. Deny, deny, and when that doesn't work, deny harder. You got a plan for when they start throwing their weight around, wing it and hope for the best, Walter suggested, which was about as solid a plan as he ever came up with. "Let's hope you've got more than blind optimism in that brain of yours," Elijah muttered, her fingers twitching at her side, itching for a tool to fix something that couldn't be fixed so easily. Walter led them through a series of back routes, avoiding the more populated areas where the Council's eyes and ears were sure to be. They needed to figure out their next move without the entire city getting wind of it. "You know, I was kind of hoping for a quiet day," Morga remarked as they paused to catch their breath. "Maybe a coffee, light treason, nothing too crazy." Walter smirked, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Where's the fun in that?" "Fun, he says," Elijah muttered. "We've got a potential uprising on our hands, and he's worried about fun." They ducked into a side room, the door sliding shut behind them with a hiss that Walter swore sounded judgmental. It was a small workspace, cluttered with the kind of tech that would make a conspiracy theorist giddy. "All right, let's piece this together," Elijah said, organizing the chaos with the precision of someone who'd done this one too many times. "The project's back on, the Council's in denial, and we've got potential clones running around. Right. No one can accuse us of having boring jobs, Morga quipped, trying to inject some levity into the grim reality of their situation. Walter pulled up the data they'd managed to swipe from the lab, the screen flickering with lines of code that danced like the devil's own tap routine. If we can trace these communications back to their source, we might get an idea of just how deep this goes. Deep enough to bury us, I'm betting, Elijah said, leaning over his shoulder. And not in a nice, restful way. As they worked, the city seemed to hum with tension. Word of their discovery, however much the council tried to squash it, was likely spreading through Thalassia like a virus, infecting the populace with a mix of curiosity and fear. It didn't help that strange occurrences were cropping up, the kind that made even the most rational minds wonder what exactly was lurking in the shadows. People reported seeing figures moving in the periphery, shadows that didn't quite match their sources, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. Anyone else feel like we're living in a bad horror flick? Morga asked, her voice low as they continued to sift through the digital detritus. If only we had popcorn, Walter replied with a wry smile, though his fingers never stopped flying over the keys. But hey, at least we're not bored. Speak for yourself, Elijah said, peering at a particularly stubborn piece of code. I was hoping for a nice, quiet breakdown of society. This is just excessive. Their banter was a thin shield against the darkness they were wading into, but it was better than nothing. I found something, Walter announced, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. Looks like there's a communication hub we missed. Go on, Elijah urged, leaning in closer. It's deeper than we thought, hidden in the lower levels beneath the main infrastructure. Clever bastards tucked it away right under our noses, Walter explained, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of discovery. Guess we know where we're headed next, Morga sighed, her resignation palpable. Why can't the bad guys ever set up shop somewhere nice? Like the beach, probably afraid of sand in their evil machinery, Walter replied with a shrug. Their levity, however gallows-infused, was short-lived. Elijah's face turned grim as she tapped into another feed. Looks like we're not the only ones interested in our little project. What do you mean? Morga asked, already dreading the answer. Security feeds. Someone's been poking around, and I don't think they are here for moral support, Elijah said, pointing to the screen as figures moved with purpose, their intentions as clear as their lack of smiles. Well, isn't that just peachy, Walter muttered. The council's in denial, but it seems like someone else is doing a little freelance espionage. Guess it's time to make our move before they do, Morga suggested, her tone leaving no room for argument. Agreed. We've got a window, and it's closing fast, Walter said, feeling the familiar rush of adrenaline that came whenever things really started to go south. Elijah nodded, already gathering her gear. I'll get us access, but after that, we're flying by the seat of our pants. Wouldn't have it any other way, Walter replied, grinning despite the tension that coiled in his gut like a nest of snakes. With a plan, flimsy though it was, forming in their minds, they left their temporary refuge, the corridors of Thalassia closing in around them like a conspiracy of silence. The city might have been in the dark about its own secrets, but they were going to drag them into the light, kicking and screaming if need be. Feels like we're on the edge of something big, Morga said, her voice barely above a whisper as they moved through the shadows. Yeah, and if we're not careful we might fall right off, Walter replied, the gravity of their situation settling in his bones like a cold, hard truth. Let's just hope we land on something soft, Elijah added, though they all knew better than to count on luck in a place like this. Navigating the underbelly of Thalassia was like trying to find your way through a maze designed by a particularly malevolent architect. Every turn seemed designed to confuse, every corridor a potential trap. Whoever built this place must have been allergic to simplicity, Morga said, her sarcasm a thin facade over the unease that gnawed at her. Probably a committee decision, Walter replied, scanning the map he'd pulled up on his wristcom. You know how they love to make things as convoluted as possible. There, Elijah said, pointing to a nondescript section of wall. Should be a hidden access point. Of course it's hidden, Walter muttered, feeling along the wall until he found the latch that opened the way into what felt suspiciously like a maintenance tunnel. The further they went, the more they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was the kind of creeping paranoia that whispered of danger just out of sight, waiting for the perfect moment to pounce. You'd think with all this technology, they'd invest in better lighting, Morga said, squinting into the dimness. Maybe they get a kickback from the flashlight manufacturers, Walter suggested, trying to ignore the way his skin prickled with unease. As they pressed on, strange sounds echoed through the tunnels, the kind that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand at attention. They were almost like whispers, but with an edge that spoke of something not quite human. "Tell me I'm not the only one hearing that," Elijah said, her voice barely more than a breath. "Nope, we're all equally creeped out," Walter confirmed, his grip on his tool tighter than necessary. "Great, so I'm not going crazy." Yet, Morga added, though she kept her eyes forward, determined not to let whatever was out there catch them unawares. Finally, they reached a door that looked distinctly out of place in the utilitarian grayness of the tunnel. It was ornate, with intricate designs that seemed to shift and change when you looked away. If ever there was a way to say keep out without words, this was it. "Well, this is inviting," Elijah noted, inspecting the door with a practiced eye. "Think it's booby-trapped?" Walter asked, his innate paranoia making itself known. "Only one way to find out," Morga replied, reaching for the control panel with the kind of confidence that made you believe she'd seen it all before. The door slid open with a sound that was almost a sigh, revealing a room filled with technology that put even their wildest guesses to shame. It was a nerve center, a place where threads of information converged, each leading to a secret better left buried. "Welcome to the heart of the mystery," Walter said, unable to keep the awe from his voice even as his mind raced to process what they were seeing. "Yeah, well, let's hope the heart doesn't decide to stop beating just because we showed up," Morga replied, though her eyes gleamed with the thrill of discovery. As they moved into the room, the walls seemed to hum with energy, a silent testament to the power and danger they were playing with. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. "All right, let's find out what they've been hiding," Elijah said, moving to one of the main consoles, her fingers flying over the controls with practiced ease. The data they found was damning. Communications, research notes, logs of experiments that stretched the boundaries of ethics past the breaking point. Everything pointed to a project that was spiraling out of control, a beast that had slipped its leash and now roamed unchecked. "Well, this just keeps getting better," Morga said, voice dripping with sarcasm. "Think they've got a how to destroy the world manual somewhere in here. Wouldn't surprise me," Walter replied, though his attention was focused on a particular file, one that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. "What have you got?" Elijah asked, noticing his sudden stillness. "Blueprints," Walter said, his voice barely more than a whisper, "for something big, something that could change everything. Just what we needed," Morga said, though her eyes held a spark of determination. "Looks like we've got our work cut out for us. More like a suicide mission," Elijah corrected, though she was already saving the data for further analysis. "Then let's make it the best damn mission this city's ever seen," Walter said, the fire in his eyes mirrored in those of his companions. They left the nerve center with more questions than answers, but with the firm resolve to see this through to the bitter end. Thalash's secrets were no longer hidden, and the world they knew was on the edge of a precipice. One way or another, they'd see it to the other side, or die trying. The corridor stretched on like a bad joke that wouldn't finish, every shadow a punchline waiting to trip you up. Walter, Morga, and Elijah trudged through it, with the kind of weariness reserved for people who've seen too much and are still expected to deal with even more. "Remind me again why we're doing this," Elijah huffed, adjusting her gear as they approached yet another nondescript door that screamed danger in its muted silence. "Because we're idiots with a death wish," Walter offered, pushing open the door with the enthusiasm of a man opening his tax bill, or so they'd expected. Instead, they were met with a cacophony of voices arguing over who knows what, which was a damn sight worse. Inside the room was a scene that looked ripped straight from a conspiracy theorist's wet dream. A dozen or so scientists in lab coats, huddled around various terminals, and at the center of it all, a sleek, grotesque machine that pulsed with an unsettling rhythm. The place reeked of burnt circuits and moral ambiguity. "Well, this isn't ominous at all," Morga muttered, her eyes darting from screen to screen. "Is that a cloning vat? Please tell me that's not a cloning vat." Walter just shrugged, his guess as good as hers. "I dunno, but it sure looks like something that'd make a mess of things if it exploded." "Exploded," Elijah echoed, finding comfort in the familiar terror such a prospect inspired. "You think everything can explode?" "It usually does," Walter retorted, keeping one eye on the scientists. His paranoia was justified when a skinny figure in the middle of the group turned towards them, eyes narrowing like a hawk spotting a particularly sluggish rabbit. Dr. Xylo, known in some circles as the mad genius, and in others as the guy with the world's worst coffee breath. He approached, his presence as unsettling as a snake in a sock drawer. "Ah, the intrepid explorers of Thalassia," Xylo crooned, his voice like oil slicked across razor blades. "I'd wondered when you'd find your way down here." "Well, you know us," Walter replied, forcing a grin. "Always chasing the next big thing like moths to a flame, or maybe flies to a pile of—" "Walter," Morga interrupted, nudging him sharply in the ribs. "Focus." "Right, sorry, Doctor." Xylo regarded them with the kind of detached amusement one usually reserves for reality TV. "You're just in time to witness the next stage of evolution. The Council might be satisfied with their petty squabbles, but I've set my sights higher." "Yeah, we gathered," Elijah said dryly, her gaze flicking to the machines. "Wasn't expecting to find a DIY kit for building an army down here." Xylo's expression soured at the implication. "Not an army, a future. The possibilities of cloning are endless, limitless customization, disease eradication, even immortality. We're talking about breaking the shackles of human limitation." "And what about the clones?" Walter asked, all traces of humor gone. "What happens to them once you've played God?" The room seemed to hold its breath, tension thickening the air like smoke. Xylo's smile returned, this time cold and reptilian. "Don't be so naive. A small sacrifice for the greater good. Progress demands hard choices." "Hard choices, sure," Morga said, her sarcasm sharp enough to cut glass. "Sounds more like let's play roulette with human lives." "Do you have any idea what you're meddling in?" Xylo snapped, his composure cracking. "These clones are the key to advancing our species, and that makes it okay to treat them like lab rats." Elijah shot back, her anger flaring. "You're breeding life, not mixing a new batch of synthale." Xylo waved her off, turning back to his work. "We could debate ethics all day, but the truth is, evolution waits for no one. You're either at the forefront or left behind." "Great sales pitch," Walter quipped, trying to ease the mounting dread. "Maybe you should try it on the Council once they find out you've been using their basement as a mad scientist's playground." "By the time they realize, it will be too late," Xylo said, confidence unyielding. "My work here will speak for itself." The trio exchanged glances, the same thought echoing between them. This was bigger and more dangerous than they'd anticipated. "What's the plan?" Elijah whispered as they huddled together, their backs turned to the oblivious scientists. "Honestly," Walter admitted, rubbing the back of his neck, "I was hoping to make some kind of dramatic gesture and then improvise." "Good to know we're sticking to our usual strategy," Morga said wryly, though the determination in her eyes betrayed her humor. "We need to shut it down," Elijah said, urgency threading her voice. "The project, the clones, everything. Before it spirals out of control." "Yeah, and how do you propose we do that?" Walter asked, eyebrows raised. "This isn't exactly flip a switch and walk away territory." "There's got to be a way," Morga insisted, scanning the room for inspiration. "A vulnerability, a fail-safe." Everyone's got a weakness. Except madmen with delusions of grandeur, Walter quipped, but his mind was already racing, sorting through possibilities. Then it hit him like a freight train. The clones, he said, snapping his fingers. We don't need to destroy the lab, just free the clones. Elijah blinked, trying to catch up. Free them. You mean just let them loose? Sure, why not? Walter replied with a grin that spelled trouble. Let's see how Xylo handles his own creations going rogue. Morga shot him a look that was half admiration, half exasperation. You really are insane. I prefer creatively unhinged, Walter corrected, already moving towards the terminal he assumed controlled the cloning vats. You're betting on a long shot, Elijah warned, though she was right there with him, fingers flying over the keyboard. Long shots are kind of our thing, Morga said, positioning herself to keep an eye on Xylo, who was thankfully preoccupied with his own delusions of grandeur. The room filled with a high-pitched whine as the machines responded to their meddling, the vats glowing with an eerie light that hinted at the chaos to come. Walter couldn't help but wonder if this was the kind of mess they'd write warnings about in future history books. Here goes everything, Elijah breathed, hitting the final command with a flourish. The vats hissed open, and chaos erupted as the clones began to awaken, their confusion evident as they stumbled from their pods. Xylo's triumphant facade crumbled as panic set in, his control slipping through his fingers like sand. What have you done? Xylo screamed, his voice cracking as the clones started moving, a sea of unfamiliar faces and uncertain futures. Just speeding up the evolutionary process, Walter called over the din, relishing the irony. The scientists scattered like rats from a sinking ship, scrambling to regain control, but the clones were already moving, following some unspoken instinct to escape. We should get out of here before they decide we're just more obstacles, Morga suggested, a pragmatist to the end. Wise words, Elijah agreed, already heading for the exit. Outside, the corridors of Thalassia felt different, charged with an energy that hadn't been there before, like the city itself had taken a deep breath and was preparing for whatever came next. Think they'll make it? Walter asked as they ran, the distant sounds of chaos still echoing behind them. Hard to say, Morga replied, not missing a beat, but at least they have a chance now. More than Xylo ever gave them, Elijah added, a fierce satisfaction in her voice. They emerged into the open, the artificial sky overhead strangely comforting after the claustrophobic lab. For a moment they just stood there, catching their breath and letting the gravity of their actions settle. Think we did the right thing? Walter asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. Probably not, Morga admitted, her usual sarcasm softened by the weight of their decisions. But it was the best bad idea we had. Yeah, Walter agreed, a faint smile touching his lips. That's us all over. Best bad ideas in Thalassia. And now, Elijah asked, glancing between her companions, what's next on the agenda, besides avoiding prison, I mean? Walter looked at her, then at Morga, and finally back at the sprawling city that hid so many secrets. Guess we keep doing what we're good at. Causing chaos, Morga asked, though her tone was more resigned than accusatory. Exactly, Walter said, with a confidence that was almost convincing. And maybe, just maybe, making things a little bit better. Or at least a little more interesting, Elijah added, and for the first time in a long while they all shared a genuine laugh. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was theirs. And in a world teetering on the brink, held together by secrets and lies, maybe that was enough. For now, anyway. The clones, once sluggish and dazed from their premature awakening, quickly morphed into something entirely unexpected. Their eyes glowed with a disconcerting mix of curiosity and calculation, like toddlers discovering their first box of matches. And the city of Thalassia was their flammable playground. Well, this just got interesting, Walter remarked as they watched from the relative safety of a nearby corridor, the chaos back in the lab spilling into the wider city like a plague of very confused locusts. Morga, ever the pragmatist, squinted at the unfolding pandemonium. Interesting isn't the word I'd use, but sure, let's go with that. Elijah, meanwhile, had her eyes glued to the terminal they'd managed to drag along. According to this, the clones are messing with the city systems. Traffic control, energy distribution. Hell, even the vending machines are on the fritz. Yeah, I always knew we'd end civilization by unleashing a horde of overly curious clones, Walter quipped. I just thought it'd be more, apocalyptic. Instead, we get vending machines spitting out energy bars like they're on sale. Elijah snorted. Well, when you put it like that, maybe we're doing Thalasha a favor. Who doesn't love a bargain? They glanced down the corridor. The clones, now exhibiting a strange sort of unity, were navigating the city with alarming ease, their adaptability far surpassing any expectations, certainly more than Dr. Xylo had anticipated. Not that they had much time to ponder his oversight. Right now, staying ahead of the exponentially evolving mob felt like a full-time job. Are they learning from each other? Morga asked, more rhetorical than seeking an answer, as they passed a group of clones now examining a public terminal with the intensity of conspiracy theorists poring over a grainy photograph of Bigfoot. Looks like it, Elijah confirmed, her fingers tapping furiously, trying to access city-wide surveillance. They're sharing information somehow, like some kind of hive mind. Great, Walter muttered. A hive mind. That's exactly what we needed, a biological internet with less privacy concerns. Don't worry, Morga said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. I'm sure they'll only use their newfound powers for wholesome activities, like knitting circles. Elijah looked up, concern etching her features. If they can take control of the systems, they could potentially shut Thalasha down completely. Walter's expression didn't waver. Yeah, but on the bright side, at least they'll be efficient about it. Morga shot him a look that was part exasperation, part grudging amusement. You'd joke about your own funeral, wouldn't you? Only if the catering was bad, Walter retorted. As they moved, the lights flickered ominously overhead, and the once steady hum of Thalasha's machinery faltered like a dying breath. The clones were getting bolder, and the trio's options were shrinking faster than a discount bin sweater in a high-heat dryer. We need a plan, Elijah insisted, her voice a tense whisper. A real plan, not just wing it and hope for the best. Okay, Walter conceded. How about this? We need to create a distraction, something big enough to draw their attention away from the systems. Big, huh? Morga mused. Think we could convince Dr. Xylo to give a motivational speech that ought to bore them into submission. Not a bad idea, Walter admitted, except he's currently too busy having a meltdown. Elijah shook her head. It's gotta be something they can't ignore. Something that taps into whatever they are learning and sharing. Walter perked up, a mischievous glint in his eye. How about a really, really big explosion? Morga sighed. Back to explosions, are we? Hey, why mess with a classic? Walter grinned. Besides, it's not like we're getting our deposit back on the lab. The clones were starting to gather in large groups, their movements synchronized, as if rehearsing for a particularly bizarre flash mob. Walter, Morga, and Elijah ducked into a maintenance tunnel, the narrow space granting them a momentary reprieve. Elijah was already hunched over the terminal, her eyes darting across lines of code. If we could overload the power grid in one of the sectors, it might cause a chain reaction, enough to grab their attention. Which sector? Morga asked, peering over her shoulder. Sector 7, Elijah decided, her fingers flying across the keys like a virtuoso pianist. It's isolated enough to prevent any casualties, but integral enough to make a hell of a noise. Walter nodded, the plan taking shape. All right then, let's give Thalasha a fireworks display they'll never forget. They worked quickly, Walter grateful for the rare moments when his knack for chaos came in handy. Even so, the tension was palpable, the air charged with the kind of anticipation that usually precedes either a brilliant coup or a spectacular disaster. Ready? Elijah asked, her finger hovering over the final command. Ready as we'll ever be, Walter replied, his voice steadier than he felt. Morga gave a tight nod, her gaze locked on the screen. Do it. With a flourish, Elijah hit the command. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the world shook. The explosion rumbled through the city like a giant clearing its throat, the blast visible even from their hiding spot. Lights flickered, systems sputtered, and for a brief, beautiful moment, everything paused. The clones hesitated, their hive mind jostled by the unexpected event. Confusion rippled through their ranks, their movements stuttering as they adjusted to the new reality. "Well," Walter said, watching the chaos unfold, "I think we got their attention." The trio watched as the clones regrouped, their collective focus diverted as they converged on the source of the explosion. It was a small victory, but they'd take what they could get. "It won't last long," Morga warned, already calculating their next move. "We need to figure out how to disable their network or at least disrupt it further." Walter frowned, scratching his head. "If only we could isolate whatever's letting them communicate and throw a wrench in it." Elijah looked thoughtful. "Maybe we don't need to destroy it. Just flood it with enough noise to break their connection, like jamming a signal." "You think that'll work?" Morga asked, skepticism lacing her words. "It's a long shot," Walter shrugged. "Long shots are our specialty, remember." "Okay," Elijah said, nodding slowly. "We can access the city's old comm towers. They're not in use anymore, but they might still have enough juice to broadcast a wideband signal." "Wide enough to drown out their network?" Walter asked. "Hopefully," Elijah replied. "Or at least buy us some more time." They made their way towards the comm towers, moving through the disorientingly quiet corridors. The explosion had left a lingering hush, the usual hum of Thalash's operations reduced to a dull whisper. "This place always creeps me out when it's too quiet," Walter muttered, half to himself. "Yeah, it's like the calm before the storm," Morga agreed, casting a wary glance around. Elijah led the way, her knowledge of the city's infrastructure proving invaluable. They reached the base of the comm towers, the structures looming above them like ancient sentinels. "Here goes nothing," Elijah said, accessing the terminal at the foot of the tower. "If we can get these up and running, we might just pull it off." Walter watched as she worked, the tension palpable. "You really think we can drown them out?" "Depends on how much noise we can make," she replied, not looking up. "Well, let's make it loud," Walter said, the hint of a grin on his lips. The towers hummed to life, their dormant circuits flickering as Elijah worked her magic. The signal burst forth, a cacophony of white noise and static roaring into the ether. The clones faltered, their movements losing cohesion as the signal scrambled their network. It was working, at least for now. "We did it," Elijah breathed, relief evident in her voice. Walter let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Looks like we're not completely screwed after all." "Don't get too comfortable," Morga warned. "They'll adapt sooner or later. But at least it gives us a fighting chance," Elijah added, her eyes still on the screen. For a moment they allowed themselves a brief celebration. It wasn't much, but in a world that seemed hell-bent on collapsing around them, a small victory was better than none. The clones, temporarily disoriented, began to retreat, their focus shattered by the incessant noise. But as always, the respite was temporary. "Think they'll give up?" Walter asked, knowing full well the answer. "Not a chance," Morga replied, her voice carrying a hint of admiration for their relentless nature. Elijah nodded, determination hardening her features. "But we'll be ready for them." As the noise continued to flood the airwaves, Walter felt a flicker of hope, a rare commodity in Thalasha. They weren't out of the woods yet, but for the first time it felt like they had a shot. "On to the next bad idea?" Morga asked, a wry smile playing on her lips. Walter chuckled, the sound almost foreign in the oppressive silence. "Onwards and upwards, my friends. Let's show these clones what humans are really made of." And with that, they steeled themselves for whatever came next, the shadows of Thalasha closing in around them. The comm towers buzzed with an energy that made Walter's hair stand on end, either a sign of impending success or an imminent trip to the afterlife. He glanced around at Elijah and Morga, who were also feeling the prickling sensation. Not that they'd admit it, of course. They'd all been playing chicken with death so long, Any real sense of fear had retired to a condo in Thalasha's metaphorical Florida. Nice to know these old towers still have some life left in them, Walter quipped, rubbing the back of his neck. Though I can't say the same for us if this goes sideways. Is it too late to call in sick? Morga deadpanned, her eyes still glued to the terminal. Elijah, ever the optimist, not that you'd ever guess, was already tweaking the signal, trying to keep their makeshift jammer from sputtering out like an old man after a marathon. This thing's held together by duct tape and prayers, she muttered, fingers working the keys with a reckless abandon usually reserved for end-of-life confessions. If it decides to take a smoke break, there'll be nothing stopping the clones from picking up where they left off. Good thing we've got you, Walter said with a smirk. No one prays harder than desperate scientists. Or drinks harder, Morga added, eyeing the flask she'd stashed in her coat for just such an occasion. It promised to be more reliable than any plan they'd cooked up so far. As the signal continued to blare, scrambling whatever neural network the clones had cobbled together, a different kind of tension simmered beneath the surface. Thalasha was getting restless, and not just because of the clone doppelgangers making a mess of the place. The citizens, those blissfully unaware of their city's existence being rocked to its core, were starting to divide. Walter had heard the whispers, the quiet conversations in shadowed corners that suggested maybe, just maybe, these clones weren't the enemy. They were humanity's next step, a new phase of evolution. That idea had the appeal of a late-night infomercial, only the product was less miracle mop and more potential extinction event. You know, some folks are saying the clones might not be so bad, Walter remarked, casting a sidelong glance at Morga. Yeah, and some folks think diet soda's a health food, Morga replied, unimpressed. Doesn't mean I'm signing up for either. They're just scared, Elijah said, though it was unclear if she meant the clones or the people who sympathized with them. Scared of what they don't understand. Fear and understanding rarely share a bunk, Walter commented, leaning back against the cold metal of the tower. But maybe we can get them talking. Morga raised an eyebrow. Since when are you an advocate for peace negotiations? Since every other option involves us getting vaporized, devoured, or worse, Walter replied. Besides, maybe the clones just need a little human touch. So we're gonna try and chat with them, Elijah asked, skepticism etched into her face like a permanent fixture. Why not? Walter shrugged. Worst case, we get ignored. Best case, we make a breakthrough and save Thalasha, or die trying. Well, when you put it like that, how can I resist? Morga said, her voice dripping with sarcasm thicker than a politician's promise. Elijah's fingers danced over the keyboard once more, this time crafting a message rather than a jamming frequency. It was a Hail Mary, a shot in the dark aimed at finding common ground with beings who might very well consider all of humanity a failed experiment. Let's hope they're feeling chatty, Elijah muttered, sending the message into the ether. Otherwise, we've just given them a new reason to finish what they started. As the signal went out, the trio held their breath, a moment of silence stretching between them like a drawn-out sigh. If the clones responded, if they were capable of responding, it might change everything, or nothing. The ambiguity was the only certainty. You think they'll reply? Morga asked, her tone unusually earnest. I'm counting on it, Walter said, though whether it was confidence or sheer stubbornness that fueled his belief was anyone's guess. Minutes ticked by, the kind that felt like hours, each second a reminder of how little control they actually had. Then just when hope was about to pack its bags and leave town, the terminal blinked to life. We've got something, Elijah announced, sitting up straighter. They're responding. Walter leaned in, eager to see what words might bridge the chasm between man and machine. The message was simple, stark. Why disturb? Why disturb? Walter read aloud, frowning. Is it just me, or do they sound a little annoyed? Maybe they were in the middle of something important, Morga suggested, her expression as serious as ever. Like world domination. Elijah didn't miss a beat. Let's see if we can buy some time. I'll respond. She typed her words careful, like choosing the right insults during a diplomatic dinner. "We want to understand your purpose. Is there a way for us to coexist?" The response came quicker this time, like a text from someone who'd been waiting by the phone. "Coexist, possible, purpose, unknown, exploration." "Exploration," Walter echoed, arching an eyebrow. "Sounds like they're as clueless as we are. Or maybe they're just being coy," Morga mused. "The universe's worst-kept secret. At least they're not immediately hostile," Elijah pointed out. "That's something to work with," Walter nodded, a plan forming in his mind like a slow-cooked stew, one that might actually not poison everyone involved. "All right, let's see if we can broker some kind of truce. Worst case, we buy more time to figure out how to fix this mess." Morga's lips twisted into a reluctant grin. "You always were a sucker for an underdog story. And you always loved a good disaster," Walter shot back. Together, they crafted a message that was equal parts diplomacy and desperation, hoping to appeal to whatever sliver of humanity might reside in their mirrored counterparts. It was a plea, a question, and a challenge all rolled into one. "We propose a meeting," Elijah typed, each keystroke deliberate. "A chance to understand each other." There was silence again, the kind that conspired with doubt and second-guessing before the terminal buzzed with a response. The clone's reply was succinct, their efficiency almost admirable. "Agree." "Meeting neutral ground." Walter exhaled, a slow, deliberate release of breath that felt like the first step on a tightrope walk. "Well, I'll be damned. Looks like we've got ourselves a date." "A date with destiny," Morga quipped, her voice tinged with irony. Elijah smiled, a rare glimmer of hope lighting up her face. "Let's just hope it's not a blind date with disaster." They set the terms quickly, outlining a location that could serve as neutral ground, an abandoned sector of Thalassia where neither party held the advantage. It was as close to a fresh start as any of them were likely to get. The hours leading up to the meeting were fraught with tension, the kind that hovered like a storm cloud, ready to unleash at the slightest provocation. Every noise sounded like an impending catastrophe, every shadow a potential threat. "Feels like the calm before the idiocy," Walter observed as they made their way to the meeting point. "Or the calm before the calm," Morga countered. "Optimism's a slow burn, Walter." Elijah, ever the realist, checked her equipment one last time. "Let's just hope they are as interested in peace as we are." "Yeah, well," Walter said with a wry grin, "if not, at least we can say we tried before everything goes to hell." The designated meeting place was a derelict marketplace, long abandoned to the elements and the encroaching tide of obsolescence. It was the kind of place where dreams went to die, fitting, given the circumstances. "We're here," Walter announced, though the statement felt redundant. They were always here, after all, in the thick of it. Now we wait. The clones arrived, their movements graceful and synchronized, their presence both alien and eerily familiar. They approached with the confidence of those who had nothing to lose, or perhaps everything to gain. One stepped forward, a perfect mirror of Walter himself, down to the sardonic twist of his lips. It was unsettling in a way he couldn't quite articulate, like looking into a funhouse mirror that stripped away flesh and intention to reveal only the raw mechanics of being. "Walter," the clone said, its voice an echo of his own. "Walter," Walter replied, because what else could he say? "Nice to meet me." The clone didn't react, at least not in any way that registered as human. "Why meet?" Walter glanced at his companions, drawing strength from their presence. "We want to understand each other, see if there's a way to live side by side without turning Thalassia into a battlefield." "Thalassia, valuable," the clone stated, its gaze unblinking. "Preservation priority." "Well, at least we agree on something," Morga said dryly, stepping forward. "We're not looking for a fight, but we won't roll over either." The clone regarded her with the same detached curiosity, its expression a dispassionate mask. "Coexistence requires change. Human resistance, obstacle." "Change is a two-way street," Elijah interjected. "We're willing to adapt, but not if it means giving up who we are." There was a pause, as though the clone was processing this, sifting through possibilities like grains of sand. Adaptation, mutual, exploration, shared. Shared exploration, Walter repeated, the words tasting foreign on his tongue. That sounds reasonable. Reasonable was a stretch, of course. It was the kind of word that implied a level of sanity none of them had seen in years, but it was a start. If we agree, the clone continued, then conflict unnecessary. The statement hung in the air, ripe with potential and peril. It was a chance, one that might cost them everything or give them a fighting shot at survival. Then let's agree, Walter said, extending a hand, half expecting it to be ignored or worse. To his surprise, the clone mirrored the gesture, its touch cool and firm. It was a handshake across the divide, a tentative step toward something resembling peace. Looks like we're in business, Morga remarked, unable to hide her relief. Yeah, Walter replied, feeling a flicker of hope kindle in his chest. Now let's see if we can keep it that way. As they turned and walked away, the clones retreating in the opposite direction, the future seemed uncertain but not bleak. It was a fragile truce, one that could shatter at any moment, but for now it was enough. Well, that went better than expected, Elijah said, a note of optimism creeping into her voice. Yeah, Walter agreed, glancing back over his shoulder. But I think I'll keep my day job just in case. And with that, they headed back into the heart of Thalassia, ready to face whatever challenges awaited them next. After all, survival was a series of calculated risks, and they'd just taken the biggest gamble of all. Walter paced like a caged animal, his footsteps echoing in the sterile confines of the lab that had become a second home, or a first prison depending on the day. Coexistence, shared exploration. Who knew diplomacy with sentient tin cans could be a full-time gig? He glanced at the terminal, half expecting it to sprout legs and join in the conversation. Doctor. Morga, never one to waste a good opportunity to needle someone, arched an eyebrow from her perch by the coffee machine. You could always write a book, How to Make Friends and Influence Artificial Intelligence. Catchy, Walter replied, rolling his eyes. I'll add it to my list of things to do if we survive. Elijah was hunched over her own terminal, fingers tapping a rhythm that was about as soothing as a symphony of malfunctioning robots. Focus, guys. We've got a chance here. If these clones are genuinely interested in cooperation, we need to make sure they see us as allies, not just inconveniences. Allies. Morga sipped her coffee, grimacing as if it had personally insulted her lineage. Because that's worked so well for us historically. Just ask the dinosaurs. Dinosaurs didn't have coffee, Walter pointed out. Neither do we, apparently, Morga muttered, shaking her cup. Walter chuckled, rubbing his temples and trying to stave off the impending migraine. All right, let's be serious for a second. We've got a meeting with the clone leader, Arian, in a few hours. What's the game plan? Elijah leaned back, her chair squeaking in protest. Simple. Highlight what we bring to the table. Humanity's resilience, creativity, and hell, maybe even our ability to find humor in a cosmic joke. More like humanity's ability to cause cosmic jokes, Morga added. Just then, the lab doors slid open with a groan, revealing Dr. Xylo, his arrival announced by the unmistakable aroma of overpriced, underwhelming space coffee. What's this about cosmic jokes? Did someone finally discover the punchline to life? Xylo, Walter greeted, trying to ignore the fact that the man's breath could probably double as a biological weapon. Perfect timing. We need your mad genius for our meeting with Arian. Xylo grinned, a lopsided smile that suggested he was either a misunderstood genius or a lunatic who'd wandered into the wrong movie set. Ah, the replicant rendezvous. How romantic. What do you need from me besides my natural charm and wit? Keep your mouth shut, Morga suggested helpfully. Walter sighed, gesturing to the machine that was supposed to be their ace in the hole. We need you to explain the neural network disruptions in a way that doesn't immediately lead to us being vaporized. Xylo waved a hand dismissively. Disruptions, neural networks, it's all semantics. The important thing is to ensure they see this as a collaboration, not a coup. Besides, I doubt the clones came all this way just to turn us into a light show. Let's hope you're right, Elijah said, shutting down her terminal with a decisive click. Otherwise, we'll be looking at a pretty one-sided fireworks display. The hours ticked by with all the subtlety of a countdown clock. Walter found himself back in the abandoned marketplace, now dubbed the neutral zone, feeling like he was about to host a slightly more lethal version of The Bachelor. The clones arrived right on schedule, moving with the kind of effortless grace that made Walter feel like a malfunctioning android. Arian, their leader, stepped forward, a perfect reflection of Walter's own features, give or take a few existential crises. Walter, Arian intoned, his voice a mirror of Walter's own though lacking the warmth of human sarcasm. Appreciate the meeting, appreciate the punctuality, Walter replied, hands stuffed in his pockets to hide the slight tremor. Let's get down to it, shall we? Elijah cleared her throat, stepping forward with the confidence of someone who had nothing left to lose. Arian, we've been thinking. Humanity and your kind were not so different. We both seek understanding, improvement, survival. Arian tilted his head, a gesture eerily reminiscent of a curious cat. Survival, mutual. Improvement, potential. Understanding, necessary. Glad we're on the same page, Xylo chimed in, his smile more unnerving than reassuring. We've got this nifty device, he gestured to the machine, that can help sync our neural networks. Think of it as a conversation starter. Morga snorted softly, whispering to Walter, yeah, because that's what we need, more reasons for them to know what we're thinking. Walter ignored her, focusing instead on Arian's response. Machine, capable. Connection, possible. Outcome, uncertain. Uncertain, sure, Walter agreed, but better than certain doom, right? Arian considered this, his expression inscrutable. Potential for harmony acknowledged, resistance reduced. Resistance is futile, Morga quipped under her breath, clearly unable to resist the opportunity for a cliché. All right, Walter said, let's talk specifics. What do you need from us to make this work? Arian's gaze shifted to each of them in turn as if assessing their worth. Cooperation, priority, trust, essential. Integration, gradual. Integration, Elijah repeated, nodding slowly. So you're suggesting a slow merge of our systems and networks. Learn from each other, figure out the best of both worlds. Exactly, Xylo said, sounding like a salesman who's just closed the biggest deal of his life. Think of it as a science experiment with very high stakes. Arian remained silent for a moment, and Walter couldn't help but wonder what wheels were turning behind those cold, calculating eyes. Agreed, Arian finally said. Initiate process. Just like that, Morga asked, skepticism lacing her voice. No dramatic monologue or villainous laughter. We are not villains, Arian replied, his tone almost puzzled as if the concept was foreign to him. Purpose, survival, outcome, beneficial. Walter felt a weight lift from his shoulders, the tension that had coiled there for so long finally beginning to unravel. Then it looks like we have a deal. Arian extended his hand and Walter shook it, the moment a mix of relief and absurdity. Here he was, shaking hands with a being that could decide to wipe humanity out on a whim. But for now, they were allies, or at least not enemies. Well, Elijah said, a genuine smile breaking through her usual stoicism, I guess that's that. Yeah, Morga added, until they realize they've been sold a lemon and come back for a refund. Walter laughed, the sound surprising even to his own ears. Let's hope our warranty holds. As they turned to leave, heading back to Thalassia with the kind of optimism that could only come from having survived another day, Walter felt the faint stirrings of something he hadn't felt in a long time, hope. So, Xylo said as they walked, his voice light with amusement, what's next on the agenda? World peace. Universal basic income. How about a hot shower and a stiff drink? Walter suggested, the thought more appealing than he'd like to admit. Ah, the simple pleasures in life, Morga mused. You know, if this whole saving humanity thing doesn't work out, we could always start a band. Elijah chuckled, shaking her head. What would we call it? The second chances, Walter replied without missing a beat. Or maybe just whoops. They all laughed, the sound echoing through the abandoned corridors of Thalassia like the ghosts of a future they were still trying to build. It wasn't much, but it was something. A beginning, perhaps. And sometimes, against all odds, a beginning was enough. As they made their way back, Walter felt the weight of 1,000 uncertainties still pressing down, but for the first time it didn't feel like an anchor. More like a tether, keeping him grounded as he navigated the uncertain tides ahead. After all, if they could negotiate peace with a clone army, surely they could tackle whatever came next. "Hey, Walter," Morga called, breaking the companionable silence. "You think the clones have a sense of humor?" Walter thought for a moment, recalling Arian's steady, unblinking gaze. "If they don't now, they will by the time we're done with them." "God help them," Elijah muttered, grinning. With that, they stepped back into the heart of Thalassia, ready to face whatever challenges lay in wait. Because in a world where secrets were currency and trust was a luxury, they just pulled off the most improbable coup of all, finding hope in the face of oblivion. For a place that was supposedly a secret, Thalassia was buzzing like a gossip mill at full throttle. Not that Walter was complaining. The more the place thrived, the less likely he'd be to end up floating in a vacuum, which was a fate he'd like to avoid. Call him old-fashioned, but he had a preference for breathing air over nothing. The integration of clones into society was like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. Only the peg was also sentient and wanted to be part of the party. Clones were everywhere, from traffic control to energy distribution, and frankly, it was a bit unsettling seeing them adapt quicker than a politician dodging a question. Walter stood on the observation deck, watching as Thalassians interacted with their cloned counterparts. It was like a bizarre dance, humans and clones weaving around each other, trying not to step on too many toes. The clones, of course, had the advantage of not getting tired, which was more than could be said for the human contingent. Elijah joined him, her expression as optimistic as a cat forced into a bath. "Well, we haven't been invaded yet, so that's something." "Always looking on the bright side," Walter replied, raising an eyebrow. "How's the terminal work going? Managed to turn it into a clone karaoke machine yet?" "Not quite," she said, the corners of her mouth twitching. "But give me time. I'm sure there's a niche market for off-key AI performances." "Better than human karaoke," Walter mused, watching a clone expertly navigate a digital interface. "At least they won't ruin any classic rock ballads." Elijah's laugh was cut short by the arrival of Dr. Xylo, whose enthusiasm for this whole endeavor was as infectious as it was unhinged. "Would you look at that?" he said, gesturing to the bustling scene below. "It's like watching ants rebuild their colony after a rainstorm." "Let's hope they don't decide to sting us," Walter muttered, recalling the precarious balance they'd struck with Arian and his kind. Dr. Xylo waved away the concerns like they were nothing more than cosmic dust. "Relax, my dear Walter. We've turned a potential apocalypse into a social experiment. If nothing else, it gives us something to do while we wait for the sun to explode." "Always the optimist," Elijah remarked dryly, though the tension around her eyes belied her humor. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Morga, who seemed to have permanently attached herself to a coffee cup. "Good news, everyone," she announced. "No one's been replaced by a clone in the last Ior. We're doing great." Walter chuckled, though the joke hit a little too close to home for comfort. "Maybe we should start a betting pool on when the first incident will happen." Morga shook her head, taking a long sip of her drink. "Nah, that's a sucker's bet. Besides, I already put money on before noon tomorrow." "Always the pragmatist," Walter said, looking back at the scene below. "What do you think the odds are of this working?" "The odds," Xylo mused, scratching his chin thoughtfully. "Well, considering we're using a device held together by duct tape and prayers, I'd say about as good as surviving a weekend in Vegas without a hangover." Elijah rolled her eyes but didn't disagree. "It's not just about the tech though, is it? It's about whether we can trust each other." "Trust is overrated," Morga said with a shrug. But it beats the alternative of constant paranoia. Walter had to agree. Paranoia was exhausting and he'd had enough sleepless nights to last a lifetime. So what's next on the agenda? Group therapy sessions with the clones. Actually, Elijah began, a hint of mischief in her voice, we're setting up cooperation workshops. You know, trust falls, communication exercises, that sort of thing. Trust falls, Walter repeated, incredulous. With clones. Sounds like a recipe for disaster. Or comedy, Morga added, her expression suggesting she wouldn't mind being around to watch. Or both, Xylo said, grinning. Either way, it'll be a spectacle. The day wore on, filled with more of the same talks, experiments, awkward introductions. It was like the universe's most bizarre mixer. But amidst it all, there was a sense of progress, like they'd finally found a way to move forward instead of merely treading water. Later that night, as the artificial lights dimmed to simulate nightfall, Walter found himself in the makeshift bar that had sprung up in what used to be the storage area. It wasn't much, but it had alcohol and a place to sit, which was more than enough. Morga was already there, sipping something that looked like it could double as engine fuel. So, she said as he joined her, how's our fearless leader feeling about the state of the Union? Walter considered this as he ordered a drink. Cautiously optimistic, he replied, with a side of let's not screw this up. Sounds about right, Morga agreed, raising her glass. To not screwing things up, Walter echoed, and they clinked glasses. The drink burned all the way down, but it was a comforting sort of burn, like it was reminding him he was still alive. Do you ever think about what's next? Walter asked after a beat. I mean, what happens if this actually works? Morga thought for a moment, her gaze distant. Honestly, I'm not sure. Maybe we all just figure it out as we go, like we always have. Seems to be a theme, Walter said, a touch of irony in his voice. Look, Morga said, turning to face him fully. We've done the impossible. We've made peace with our own reflections. If we can do that, who knows what else we're capable of? Walter nodded, taking in her words. They were a reminder of how far they'd come despite the odds. Despite everything. Here's to hoping we never have to find out what else we can do, he said with a wry smile. Morga laughed, the sound rich and full. Cheers to that. As the night wore on and the makeshift bar filled with the low hum of conversation and laughter, Walter felt the weight of the day, the week, the whole damn ordeal start to fade. It wasn't gone, not by a long shot, but it was manageable, like a distant headache you could almost forget was there. Eventually the others joined them, Elijah and Xylo, even a few clones who seemed eager to understand the human concept of unwinding. Drinks flowed, stories were told, and for a moment it was easy to forget the precariousness of their situation. Elijah was in the middle of recounting some particularly absurd incident from her past, something involving a broken terminal and a very irate space cat, when a clone seated nearby spoke up, his voice halting but earnest. Why do humans find humor in difficult situations? The question stopped Elijah mid-sentence, and she exchanged a look with Walter, who simply shrugged. Because it's either laugh or cry, she replied finally. And laughing's a hell of a lot more fun, the clone nodded, considering this. Understanding increased, appreciation felt. See, Morga said, grinning. They're getting the hang of it. The clone attempted a smile, an expression that was both awkward and endearing. Humor, valuable, connection, essential. Walter raised his drink. To connection, then. To connection, the group echoed, and for once the toast felt more than just words. It was a promise, a hope for a future they had yet to fully imagine. As the night deepened and the laughter grew, Walter found himself reflecting on the absurdity of it all. Here they were, humans and clones, drinking together like old friends at the end of the universe. It was a scene he wouldn't have believed possible just days ago. But that's the thing about humanity, he realized. They were nothing if not adaptable, capable of finding light in the darkest of places. And maybe, just maybe, that was their greatest strength. When the night finally gave way to morning and the makeshift bar began to clear, Walter lingered a moment longer, watching as the clones helped clean up, their movements efficient, careful. He couldn't help but smile at the sight, a small, private gesture of hope. As he made his way back to his quarters, the corridors quiet save for the soft hum of the lights, he thought about the future. It was uncertain, as futures tended to be, but for the first time in a long time he didn't dread it. "Hey, Walter," Elijah called as she caught up with him, her expression tired but content. "Think we'll ever really trust each other?" He pondered the question, considering the progress they'd made, the challenges still ahead. "Trust takes time," he said finally. "But I think we've got a good start." Elijah nodded, seemingly satisfied with his answer. "Here's to hoping it sticks." "Here's to that," Walter agreed, and together they walked into the new day, ready to face whatever it might bring. Because in this strange, unpredictable world, there was one thing they'd learned better than anything else. It wasn't about knowing what was next. It was about being ready to meet it head-on, with a smile and a snide remark. And maybe, if they were lucky, a little bit of hope.